All right, so as the introduction said, my name is Lindsay Holmwood. I'm Oxesis here on Twitter. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about sort of both technical and broader organizational culture change. So to start this story, I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of the most professionally distressing periods that I've ever had in my technical career. So, oh, it helps if I plug that in as well. Very good. So pretty early on in my management career, I had sort of built up this team over a course of a couple of years. It was very small. We grew very organically, and we sort of added like an additional person to the team, maybe once or twice a year. And so after about sort of 3 or 4, it's all in. It's intentionally blank. Oh, there we go. I should totally like update the text on it to say that as well. So yeah, I'd been leading this team for a couple of years, and the team was actually performing really, really well. And in fact, it was consistently rated within the organization as one of the highest performing teams, and the people that also rated themselves as having the highest level of satisfaction over any of the teams within the organization as a whole. So, you know, that was something that I was quite proud of, particularly sort of being a fairly junior manager at that point. And I sort of decided, I got to a point in this organization that, you know, I wanted to go off and do something different, but I decided that I would do a little bit of consulting back to the organization as well, sort of to pay the bills while I was sort of off doing this other stuff that I was finding personally interesting. And within the course of about 6 months of me switching to being in a consulting position out of a management position, 50% of the team had left. So at that point, I was Damien's Jason in his story that he was talking about yesterday, right? Where, you know, Jason left and so did he. And you know, that was something that wounded me quite significantly, quite professionally, because it's something that I'd invested so much time and effort into building up, and to see it sort of just disappear so quickly, you know, that was very difficult to sort of comprehend. And that sort of drove me to do a whole bunch of soul searching to understand, you know, what are the contributing factors and why did this even happen in the first place? What did I miss in the first place when building the team that allowed the team to sort of come apart at the seams so quickly? And this really comes to this question of like, what makes the high-performing teams in organizations endure beyond the tenure of the people that are running them or just in the team in general, right? And so that sort of goes to this deeper philosophical question of how do you go about creating a resilient culture, both within the technical side of the organization, but just more broadly, right? And we know for a fact that organizations that go through existential crises tend to do a very good job of binding together because they have a shared, common, unified goal that they're working towards. So how do you actually create that sort of resiliency in the face of that sort of existential threat without actually introducing an existential threat into the organization? Because, you know, existential threats are not so fantastic for people's morale at times. And that sort of leads to this more just general question, which we've seen a couple of speakers throughout the conference touch on a couple of times, which is like, what is culture? So we've seen a bunch of sort of folk descriptions about what people sort of feel culture is, but it turns out that there is a huge amount of research in organizational psychology going back to the 50s and 60s that we can actually use to be able to identify and analyze organizational culture that we're sort of surrounded by on a day-to-day basis. So the main person here is this dude called Edgar Schein, and Edgar Schein is sort of a pioneer in the field of organizational psychology. So he takes an anthropological perspective on this and tries to understand it from like the stories that people tell about the organization. He's written a whole bunch of really fantastic books, which are, you know, basically the industry standard for how we view doing analysis and identifying different types of cultures that we've got within, you know, that we're experiencing and a part of on a day-to-day basis. And so Schein's got these 3 levels of culture. He's got artifacts at the top, where they're the things that we see the most of. Then we've got values within our organization. And then we've got these underlying assumptions, which are hidden and somewhat difficult to discern. And so those cultures that we're part of actually exist at multiple levels. We've got like a broader national culture. We've got the organizational culture that we're all living and working in on a day-to-day basis. You know, a third of our lives are spent working. Then we have the team culture, so the smaller team is part of the broader organization that we're a part of. And then there's just this broader occupational culture. In fact, we're in that right now, right here in this room, right? We're part of an occupational culture which is about technology, right? So that's the common thing that's bringing us all here together. And these three things, the artifacts, the values, and assumptions, exist at all these different types of cultures that we're part of. So let's talk about artifacts, and what does that actually mean? Well, artifacts are the physical manifestations of our culture. They are the most obvious signs of what our culture values and what our culture creates. And so they're things in our organizations like ceremonies that we run on a day-to-day basis, like stand-ups, retrospectives, that sort of thing. They're our organization charts, how we choose to allocate and distribute people within our organization to achieve a particular goal that the organization is moving towards, what reporting lines look like, that sort of thing. The desk layout, whether you're in a big open plan office that is really incredibly noisy and difficult to concentrate on, or if you're in some sort of cube farm from hell, right? Either of those are sort of two ends of a different spectrum about like what the actual artifacts of your organization is producing and the sort of things that it's valuing for people to be able to do work. It's also the documentation, so like the written processes and guides that people have got to go through, how people get onboarded into the organization. And then finally, from a technical perspective, which is quite interesting to us, another artifact of our cultures of our organizations are the software that we produce and the reason that we're producing it in the first place, and what's the sort of value that we're trying to create by creating that software. And so all of these artifacts are the most visible parts of an organization's culture, and they're also the easiest parts of organizational culture to be able to adopt. Because we hear about things that we see at all the DevOps events about continuous delivery and continuous deployment. It's like, okay, well, like that maybe that's an artifact of a particular culture, but maybe that's something that we can take and make work within our organization. Maybe building a cross-functional team is something that we can try and make work. All of those things are artifacts, and they're relatively easy to cargo cult. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to apply gently or even cleanly with the organization when you try and bring it in. So that goes down to this next level of of Shine's sort of three-tiered model, and that's values. So values are these conscious goals, strategies, and philosophies that we have for our organization. So these are very clear articulations of like what the organization values, what behavior it's willing to tolerate, what behavior it's not willing to tolerate. And it's the stories that we tell, essentially, about what's happening within our organization and why we're here, what's the reason for our existence in the first place. And from these, we have rules that guide how we go about interacting with people, and not just that, but also how we go about doing work within the organization. And so those can be really specific, specific and high level. So if we look at like high level stuff, it's like we're going to go about dominating the market, right? Management is available and it listens to our concerns. And this might be written down in a document, or maybe it's something that we say, it's a story that we tell one another. We value quality over the speed to delivery, right? That's another example of this value. Nobody is going to be fired for making an honest mistake on the job, right? That's a pretty bold statement to make around our organizations, and that's it's a very big guide for how we go about doing work. And the thing that we've got to consider about values is that there's a difference between the lived values that we actually do on a day-to-day basis within our organization versus the aspirational values that quite often get written down into business plans or on a nice little plaque in the foyer for your office and that sort of thing. And people have got a pretty good nose for bullshit. They can tell the difference between lived and aspirational values. So, a couple of examples of these sort of values that you might see is like communication. We have an obligation to communicate. We treat others as we would like to be treated ourselves. We work with the customers and prospects openly, honestly, and sincerely. We're satisfied with nothing less and the very best that we can do in everything that we do. And we conduct business affairs in accordance with all applicable laws and in a moral and honest manner. Now, these things all seem like pretty reasonable, pretty straightforward. You've probably got something like that in your organization, in your organization's value statement. But the cool thing about these core values of an organization were these were the core values of Enron. Right, so that's that disparity between the lived values and the aspirational values, right? And when you start digging a little bit deeper into it, we sort of go down to the underlying assumptions. That helps us discern how seriously we take a lot of these values within our organization. And again, it's about navigating the gap between how we imagine that work is done in our organization, how we write it down and the stories that we tell there versus how it's actually done at the front line, at the pointy end. And it's really important when we're crafting these value statements to the people in our organization to be clear about what values are what, right? And that leads us down to the final level, which is assumptions, right? And assumptions are sort of difficult to actually get to. These are like the unconscious beliefs, perceptions and thoughts and feelings that we have when we actually do the work on a day-to-day basis. And all of these exist at an unconscious level, and quite often they're unspoken, right? There are things that you sort of discover after working at a place for a long time, and it's like, oh, okay, so like there's this other hidden thing that we don't really talk about, but it just sort of seems to drive the behavior about how we actually do stuff within the organization. And these things are really, really hard to discern and actually identify. So, an example of that is that anybody can take on a leadership responsibility. It doesn't have to necessarily be stated, but when you've got people that are stepping up into leadership roles and they're doing that work, it's an underlying assumption that's sort of driving how the organization works. Maybe another more negative assumption is that bad outcomes come from bad people, right? And so we want to get rid of bad people in our organization. Maybe another negative assumption is that it's okay to withhold information from our peers or from our management or from our employees. Or maybe individual performance is valued over the actual team's performance, right? You've probably seen cases like this in your professional career as well. And that goes to things like, we can't trust that team for doing that thing over there. And then you see sort of like the high level value of the like clearly articulated value of like people over profits versus like the actual underlying assumption, which is often like profits over people. And when you've got people that sort of stay at an organization long enough and they actually try and understand what these assumptions are, quite often they sort of left feeling a little bit like this. All right. So given that we have this model for understanding what culture actually looks like and how we interact with it and how we can shape it, let's talk about how we could actually change what the culture actually looks like by changing our people, right? And Graham Henry, the previous head coach of the All Blacks, had this really fantastic saying, which is that better people make better All Blacks. And so we're going to focus specifically on the people side of things. So what makes a good team member? What makes a good person that you want to bring into the organization? So we're going to start at the very, very base level. And you'll notice that there's a bit of overlap here with the model that was presented earlier in the day by Alex and Troy. With that sort of 5 dysfunctions of a team. The underlying one there that you need to be able to deliver anything as a team is to have trust within that team, right? So trust, a big part of having trust is about having vulnerability, personal vulnerability and being vulnerable with other people in that team about, what you actually really think and feel, and being honest and open and humble with those people in the team. And part of doing that is that we have to sort of embrace this mentality that we're going to assume the best of other people within our organization, right? Not everybody is out trying to get you and trying to screw you over. So you've got to give people the benefit of the doubt. The other thing one of the other things to be able to build trust with other people in the organization is we're looking for people that are either implicitly or explicitly aware of their cognitive biases. And there are a couple of cognitive biases that actually play into a bunch of these things. So being aware of the fundamental attribution error, people sort of vaguely familiar with what that might be? Okay, so just a couple of hands. So fundamental attribution error is really simple. So we judge others by the actions that they take, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. So an example of that might be that you're driving on a highway and suddenly this driver in another lane swerves in front of you and you go, wow, that person's a dickhead. How do they possibly get their license in the first place? I would never possibly drive like that. But and you're analyzing their actions, right? And you're forming a judgment about that based on the actions that they've taken. But of course, the person may have actually been swerving to move out of the way of a piece of wildlife that was on the road, right? So they had a good intention for swerving, and even though it may have hurt somebody else, right? And so that's sort of that gap there that the fundamental attribution error sort of fills in. So the other interesting cognitive bias that we need to be aware of as well when building trust with other people is the hindsight bias. So the hindsight bias is also known as the knew it all along effect. And so we talk about, in the hindsight bias, we talk about events and bad outcomes with knowledge of what the outcome is. We don't start at the beginning and work our way forward. We start at the outcome and then we work our way back. And it's actually a type of memory distortion that's like really, really fundamental to who we are as a species, actually. So when we recall memories, we do it in a way that's forming a judgment and making ourselves look good and making other people look bad. And typically we're saying, you are responsible for this failure. Like, not me, you. And that's because you were neglectful, you were inattentive, you were derelict of duty, right? And this is like a really core part of what our society is. And we'll see it in a couple of cases. And the sort of underlying assumption here is that bad outcomes can only come from bad actions, and bad actions can only come from bad people. And so within literally days of the MH17 air disaster, we were seeing news stories like this, right? The MH17 tragedy reveals the need for a flight path overhaul. The Malaysian Airlines could have avoided the Ukrainian airspace for $66 per person. Like, why were they over a conflict zone in the first place, right? And so that's analysing the bad thing that has happened through, with the knowledge of the outcome, right? And these are lines from like really, really well-known and well-respected publications. Well, maybe not Daily Mail though. So the hindsight bias is very much your culture killer. It's the thing that taints all of your interactions with other people on your team and with your team and other teams within the organization. And so you can sort of think of the hindsight bias as giving this sort of distorted view in this tunnel here. And so the people that are within the situation are sort of moving forward in that tunnel. And you notice, like you can see a couple of people here and there, right? And it doesn't quite look the same. You can see the person, but you don't have the same perspective that they do when something bad is happening. And so that's why it's really important when bad things happen that we try and explain in terms of foresight. We pick a point in the past and then we work forward from that to try and get an understanding of the context and why people made particular decisions and what made sense to them at that point in time. And that sort of goes to this whole idea of trust as being like really, really hard to build and easy to lose, because if you let the hindsight bias or the fundamental attribution error creep in, it's really, really easy to taint those interactions with other people in your organization. In fact, there's a really good ratio for measuring how you actually go about rebuilding a relationship with somebody after you've done them a wrong. It's the 5-to-1 ratio. So basically for every one bad thing that you do to somebody, you need to do a minimum of 5 things to be able to make it up for them. In fact, it may be even a little bit more than that. It might be closer to 7 or 10. It sort of varies culture to culture and situation to situation. So the next thing that the easiest thing that you can do if you're in a management or leadership position is to try and hold regular one-on-ones with the people as a way to be able to build trust with people. And this is really, really difficult because our schedules are so packed on a day-to-day basis, but it's so valuable to be able to create that feedback loop from the people that are at the front lines, for the people that are meant to be providing leadership to the team. And the whole point about doing this is that we're trying to create a space for people to be able to vent, right, about problems that they see within the organization and they don't have anybody to be able to talk to. And so if you provide that sort of pressure valve, then it's become something that people are able to deal with. Maybe even something a little bit more constructive, like we're creating a space for people to be able to complain. So I have a very specific complaint about this thing. I want to help you try and understand my perspective on it, and I want to try and work together to try and solve that issue. And these one-on-ones need to be regular. They need to be a minimum of half an hour, and preferably every week or every fortnight. And it's really important if you're in a leadership or management position to be able to take a genuine interest in these people. Like they're not just employees; they're actual people, right? And so you've got to treat them with dignity, humility, and respect. So one other interesting thing that we should also consider as well is eliminating performance reviews within our organization. So there's been a bunch of research that's come out more recently, actually pretty much over the last 5 years, that's showing fairly consistently that performance reviews, like annual performance reviews, have a negative impact on employee productivity, their levels of anxiety, and their levels of stress, because it's this one big thing that happens once a year that it's sort of like a big bang deployment, right? You're batching up all the bad feedback for one shot and you're going to lay it on the person. And you have that happen to you once in your career, and you're going to feel anxiety about it for any other time in your career. And so the whole point about it, like if you're conducting regular one-on-ones with people, is that there shouldn't be anything that would be surprising if you're coming into a performance review anyway, right? You shouldn't be holding information back. If there's a problem, you go and address it immediately. You do this as having that regular feedback loop with the people in the organization. So the next thing that we're looking for with the people that we want to join our organization, and the characteristics and attributes that we want to build in the people that are already there, is that we're looking for people that can thrive in conflict. So that might sound a little bit weird, but what I'm actually talking about here is the conflict around ideas as opposed to conflict around personality, right? So we're talking about arguing about ideas versus like the interpersonal conflict. And we need people that are able to discern between the two, right? They can tell the difference between somebody is arguing against your idea versus somebody's actually attacking me by saying these particular things to me. And so the value that we're looking for in our people here is we want people that have got strong opinions and will hold fast to those. during the debate, but at the same time they need to be loosely held, so they need to be able and willing to be able to change their mind based on new information that they receive as part of that debate. It's really important to have people that are willing to play the devil's advocate within your organization. And so there's a whole bunch of information and studies on this, like one in particular actually around the New York Stock Exchange traders. So teams of traders who allocated a devil's advocate when they were making a decision about like a big trade that they were going to do, had higher long-term performance with those investments that they made compared to teams that didn't appoint a devil's advocate. And that was because the team had to go through the mental hoops and the exercise of actually arguing the point and why they should make that particular investment. And the devil's advocate was responsible for for holding those people to account and actually testing the validity of their arguments. So with that sort of builds onto this final thing, which is around committing and acting. Right, and what do I actually mean by that? Well, the whole point about sort of having these feedback loops with people is that it becomes a lot easier to be able to do shared goal setting with people in your organization, right? And so the whole idea here is that the leadership is there to assist and facilitate. It's not there to solutioneer and come up with an idea and a solution to that, and then push it down and delegate it to the people that are at the front line. Because quite often the people at the front line have got a completely different view on what's actually happening, right? They've got greater context about what's happening in the organization than people further up the management hierarchy. And so your responsibility in a management and leadership position here is to provide context around the strategy, what makes sense about this particular goal and this objective that we're moving towards. Right, and then also provide context around what does good look like, what's the desired outcome, right? That's pretty much the responsibility of management and leadership in these sort of situations. And it's so vital that the ideas actually come from the bottom up, from the people that are at the front line, because they have that context that you often lack the further up the management chain you go. And leadership is there to facilitate. Now, one interesting point about this is that you don't actually need consensus. When we're saying we're facilitating, we're there to facilitate the argument and the discussion. And remember, it's an argument and conflict around ideas, not around people. But just because you're there to facilitate doesn't mean that you're there to build consensus amongst everybody in the team. Like, you want to have a variety of opinions, and if the best opinion and the best argument wins out, then that's fantastic. But that's often not the case. Often it's not cut and dry, right? But part of being in that management or leadership position is to not build consensus, but you're actually there to just build commitment for the team, right? Committing to a particular idea and a course of action and a strategy, and then you're getting the team to commit to that and then act on it. Right. And so that means that you're looking for people that are able to put their personal opinions aside. So they may not have won the argument and they may be harboring a little bit of resentment to that. And so, they're not going to be fully committed and buying into that and actually going to try and make that happen. And when they do that, they don't have to actively try and sabotage the thing that the team is committed to. They just have to nod and say yes and then go back to their desk and then do nothing to help. In fact, it'd sort of be preferable if people would actively sabotage, right? Because then you could just identify it and call it out. That would be sort of nice in our organizations. So the disagreement that we have within these sort of sessions where we're building this shared context and trying to work on what the goal is together, the disagreement there is completely okay. But the outcome that you're looking for at the end of it, and this is something that I find myself uttering relatively frequently actually, is like, I don't actually agree with that decision, but I'm going to do absolutely everything that I can in my power to make it actually succeed. Okay, so now we've got an idea about the sort of characteristics and attributes that we're looking for people that can be part of a high-performing team. Let's actually talk about what makes a good team in itself. And going back to this quote about better people make better All Blacks, we're talking about the All Blacks part rather than the people part here. So one really important factor for improving the level of control that people have got, that they feel that they've got over their work environment, is that you need to be able to give them influence on the hiring process for the people that are coming into the organization, right? And the whole point about the hiring process is that you're looking for attributes that indicate a willingness to adapt when working in a team, right? And so adapt and adopt strategies and ideas that may not be preferable to them. And so a really simple way that we can think about this is like chunking up your hiring process to be like a MapReduce sort of thing. So what might that actually look like? Well, the first step, like a map step, we're there to get the team members to try and qualify the team fit of the person that we're trying to bring in. Do they actually have attributes that match and values that match what our organizations is, or do we think that they're able to change and be part of the organization? Do we think that they're going to be a good team player? And of course, you've got to be careful that you're not hiring for a monoculture at the same time. Then the next step is around qualifying the technical talent, and that might be a whiteboarding exercise or a code review or pair programming or something like that. And then the final step is like essentially a rubber stamp from the team lead. In fact, it's preferable not to have the team lead involved until a little bit later in the process. That's sort of the final reduction step. And for this to work effectively, you need to have a consistent script. So everybody is objectively measured, against the same standard. But you also need to be prepared to improvise on that as well, based on the people that come through the door. They might not quite do the stuff that and act in the way that you would normally expect. So every question has to test a hypothesis, right? And a hypothesis might look something a bit like the candidate can distinguish between criticism of themselves and their work, or the candidate can engage in conflict around ideas. To make this process work effectively, everybody in that process needs to have the veto power. So everybody needs to be able to put up their hand and say, actually, no, I don't think this person is going to be the right fit, either for technical reasons or for cultural reasons. And so we're going to let them know and we're going to move on to the next person, right? And in the case where you finally get to that final reduction step and the leadership is vetoing the decision at the very last moment, treat that as a systemic problem with the team alignment, not with the hiring process or the people that are there, right? Because if the process is working effectively, the team is filtering out those people earlier on before it even manages to get to the person that's got nominal responsibility, leadership responsibility for the team. And there are a whole bunch of benefits by doing this. So the first benefit is the team has the ability to be able to talk to their candidate. And like Ken was talking about yesterday, having that control and being able to exert a bit of control over the work environment that you've got is a really big contributing factor to burnout. And so we want to be able to do this in a way that the team is able to do this without having any of the leadership present. And vice versa, the candidate needs to be able to talk to the team as well without any leadership present, because you can get one particular story, one particular narrative from the person that's running the show, but of course the story on the ground can be very, very, very different. And by doing this, we end up getting many different perspectives on the particular person that's coming in through the door, and the person that's coming in through the door also has a better idea about what they're walking into. And then we can also unblock a bunch of management bottlenecks, right, by making sure that we're distributing the process across different people in the team. So which often, if you're doing lots of hiring really rapidly and really quickly, becomes a big problem if the person that's leading the team is meant to be doing all of the interviewing as well. Of course, the risk in all of this is that you end up uncovering dysfunction and misalignment in your teams. And so, if you're not actually willing to address that, then maybe this hiring strategy isn't for you. But the whole point about doing this is that we're trying to hire good people and then we get out of their way and just let them do the work, right? So we construct a process in a way that we can get the right people through the door. They match our culture to a certain extent and some of our values. We believe that we could work effectively with them. And they've got the aptitude, and then they're in the door, they're good to go, right? The next thing about building an effective team is having diversity and inclusion. So what do I actually mean by that? So we're talking about diversity of race, gender, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status, but also the location of people, whether you're allowing people to work from home or not, or whether they've got to travel a particular distance, whether they've got a particular disability, the level of experience that person has got, or just maybe plain old the work hours, right? Some people just want to work part-time because they've made certain choices about their life and that's the way that they want to engage as part of the workforce. And so you hire for diversity by seeking out diverse candidates. And what does that actually mean? Well, it means that you attend meetups and you go to places where people that you would not normally have in your organization are attending, and you go there and you listen and you sit down and you take into account what they've got to say, right? And you can also do that by sponsoring those events as well to show, very actively that this is a cause that you're interested in involving and progressing, right? And One other really interesting thing that you can do for the job descriptions and the position descriptions that you're writing is that you make it very clear in those job descriptions what are the attributes that you're looking for in the people. You can talk a little bit about the sort of technologies that the team is working with, but you can be very clear about like whether those are negotiable or not, so whether you allow for retraining on the job. But then finally, you state very clearly that you're seeking candidates that come from diverse backgrounds, right? Because that's sending a very clear signal that it's something that the organization as a whole values, and the team that they're going to be working in values as well. But all of this is for naught if you don't actually include, adapt, and embrace different parts, differences as part of your culture, right? So the diversity is on the one hand, it's about getting the right people in the door, but inclusion is about adapting the culture based on the people that you've actually brought into the organization. And that's going to be hard. That's going to be really, really hard. That means changing things that are typically the way that we do things here. It means listening to new and dissenting voices. It means there are going to be uncomfortable conversations. It also means in a management and leadership position that you've got to have people that are creating safe mechanisms for people to raise criticisms. And what do I mean by safe? Well, I'm talking about voluntary reporting mechanisms that are non-punitive. So if somebody speaks out and says, hey, there's a problem here and I think that we need to have a talk about it, they're not going to be punished for it, right? And finally, once we've got all those things in place, it actually means acting on the criticism. It's like, yeah, we've totally got a channel where you can talk to us and tell us about all the problems, but we're never actually going to do anything about it, right? It's really important that you actually act on that criticism. So the next attribute that we're looking for in a team is the leadership in the absence of leadership. And that might sound a little bit weird, but I'll explain what I'm talking about here. We're touching things that are both values and assumptions of the way that the team and the organization as a whole works. So I'm a very firm believer that having a title isn't a requirement for any sort of leadership within the organization, right? Leadership can come from anywhere. And this is really important in a team where if the lead steps away from the team has to continue functioning effectively for an extended period of time. That's how you know that you've created a high-performing team. And so surprises when the team lead comes back and things aren't quite the way that they would have expected them to be, indicators of team misalignment. And that's something that you've got to work on to be able to sort of build that shared trust and that goal and that vision that the team is working towards. And the whole point about this is that you're there to sort of, to be the Jason for everybody, or at least allow everybody to be their own Jason, right? Giving the team their own shit umbrellas so that it's not the responsibility of one person that's sitting up the top, to sort of provide that protection for all the team. The team is relatively resilient in that way. And so by doing that, the team is then able to foster conflict around ideas themselves, right? You're there to facilitate, but if you step away, other people are going to be able to do that as well. The team has the authority and the autonomy to remove the blockers themselves, and that sort of goes to this underlying idea of asking for forgiveness and not permission. And so David Marquardt, who was mentioned earlier in the day, with his book, Turn the Ship Around, has a really, he actually spends quite a bit of time earlier in the book talking about this idea of empowerment versus authority, and he sort of rails quite heavily against the whole idea of empowerment. So his central argument is that empowerment is about giving permission from above to people, right? And that's actually a way of lending power to people for a short period of time, but it can be revoked, right? If for whatever reason, seemingly arbitrary reasons often. Whereas authority is about giving power, granting power, and it's not about taking it back and saying, hey, you have that responsibility to do it, and all of this lays on you. And so it's about granting autonomy to the team and the responsibility and the accountability for doing stuff, and then asking them to ask for forgiveness when they don't quite meet up to the broader goals and expectations. This plays into this whole idea of local rationality, where people make choices based on the information that they have at hand, what they consider to be the best choice based on the information that they've got at hand. Right? And so you can sort of think of leadership a bit like a bird in your hands, right? If you hold it too loosely, it's going to fly away. If you hold it too tightly, you're going to crush it. And that frees up the team leaders in the organization to observe and influence trends and behavior across the organization, provide better context to the team, and also provide minor course corrections rather than trying to turn the ship around. So the last thing that we're looking for in effective teams is them to be part of something bigger than just the team in itself, right? We're here to help people build up for the next job. People are in our workplaces and we're working with them for a short period of time. But they're not going to be here forever, right? And so we sort of have this obligation to them. We're spending so much time with them that we're going to try and deepen their skills and experience so that they be better, or so that they're better contributors within the organization that you're part of, but also they're going to be better when they move out and they go find a job someplace else. So like guilds and the Spotify model is a really nice way of sort of doing that and fostering, like particularly in a larger organization, sort of fostering the cross-pollination from different teams that you've got there. And so those guilds can be around technology, leadership, delivery, service design, product management, those sort of things. And really simple way to get them going is you just run them like meetups, so regular, fortnightly. You put 1 to 2 talks, maybe a lean coffee thing where people can sort of vote and discuss ideas and they can sort of self-select that themselves. And we're getting the senior management to come and observe as well, finally, once you've actually got that running, which means that they're there to be present, to be visible, to contribute, but only when they're asked to. Right. So given those 3 things that we put together, how do we actually go about making the culture itself resilient? Well, we talk a lot about culture in the DevOps space, and what we're actually typically talking about is technology culture and occupational culture that we have within our organization, right? The thing that we've got to realize though is that the technical culture itself isn't actually created in a vacuum. The technical culture is shaped by the broader organizational culture that the technology people in the organization are part of. And to some extent, it's quite reflective of the broader organizational culture. That's why when you bring in artifacts from other cultures and you try and make them work, sometimes they get rejected. And so Deming has this fantastic quote, which is that a bad system beats a good person every time. It doesn't matter how great the artifact is that you're bringing in or how strong the person is who's pushing for that particular thing to happen. If the system isn't there to support them, then it's not going to happen, right? And we know, we've got a long proven track record in the DevOps space of changing technical culture. But the question is, how do we make it resist the influence of the broader organizational culture? Like, how do we scale DevOps beyond just the technology space? So going back to Shine's model, we know that our systems are effectively artifacts of the culture, right? Our processes are also artifacts of the culture. And the artifacts can influence the values that we've got within our organization, and the values can influence the artifacts of the organization. Values can also influence the assumptions, and the assumptions then drive the values that we've got. So we can think of these systems and the software and technology that we're producing as being a snapshot of our culture at a particular point in time. But they also do evolve and move forward. And when we're talking about culture, we're talking about a snapshot of the organization's values and assumptions. And we know that artifacts influence behavior, right? If you're using like a door handle every day and it doesn't quite work to get through, like you're going to get a little bit shitty about that, right? And so, that makes you feel not so great, perhaps, about some of the values that the organization has got when the organization very clearly doesn't value like basic things like, maintaining a door handle. And we know that working with those artifacts changes the perceptions of the organization's value as well. So perhaps one way that we can go about scaling up and sort of broadening the DevOps culture to our whole organization is that we can encode the organizational behavior that we want to see into the artifacts that the organization is producing. So we can think of that as if we change our organization's values, we can actually, we can do that by changing the artifacts themselves. So an example of that is like we make deployment fast and safe. We ensure quality by going fast. If we build cross-functional teams, we can work together to achieve a shared goal. That's the value that we're driving out there. If we create artifacts like giving autonomy, eliminating sign-off, granting access, but logging everything, we're saying that we're asking for people we're asking people to ask forgiveness and not permission to do something in the first place. And then finally, we run post-incident reviews. That's sort of a practice that's fairly easy to introduce into our organization, and perhaps pre-accident investigations as well. And that's sort of reinforcing this organization value that failure is an opportunity for learning, as opposed to something that should be shunned. So by doing this, we grow our people, we paint a new future of what the values are that we want our organization to live and breathe, and we do that through technology. We build systems that reflect the values that we want. And by doing that, we deepen the people and we weather the organization. I'm Lindsay, and thank you very much. Questions? If we've got time?
Yes.
Cool.
What's a pre-incident review?
Oh, right, like a pre-accident investigation. So I totally didn't have enough time to include that content, but so there's a really interesting way that you can use hindsight bias to give you a better clue into what the future may actually look like. So before you do, say, like a big launch or something like that, something that you know the organization is going to incur a lot of risk to do, you get people into a room and you ask them, hey, okay, so we're going to do this thing at this time and all you people are going to be involved here. So let's brainstorm all the things that we think could potentially go wrong, right? And so that's sort of using the power of foresight, right? It's like, okay, well, we're going to do this thing, and okay, I can possibly see that bad thing happening there, but it probably won't. But let's put it down anyway. But then you do a second, you do a second part of that exercise immediately after, which is you say, okay, we've just launched the thing, we've just made the thing happen. It's 5 minutes beyond that. What are all of the things that have just gone wrong? Right, and by doing that, we're actually using the power of the hindsight bias there to actually give us a very different perspective over all the things that have actually gone wrong. And you tend to find that you get quite different answers from the same group of people just by doing it that way. So that's sort of like what a pre-accident investigation is. Any other questions? Up the back there.
You talked about a performance review and the related demerits of it.
Yep.
So is there any alternative that you could try and suggest?
One-on-ones. Yep. I mean, a performance review is essentially a one-on-one that you perform once a year, right? I mean, if you're doing one-on-ones once a year, there's something bad happening, right? So you do them more regularly, more frequently. It's that whole DevOps thing of, if it hurts, do it more.
Resistance. Well, when you implement certain ideas, you're probably going to deal with a lot of resistance. How some approaches on ideas to help, because it's something that probably everybody faces every day.
Yep, absolutely. So I find the best way to demonstrate the value of an idea is you actually go and do it, and then you point back at the evidence, right? The way, like I work in government, I'm sort of responsible for driving broader technological change within the Australian government. There are always people that are going to have better words than me. They're going to be able to tell more convincing arguments because they've done it for a longer period of time, right? And so, while you can engage them in that sort of conversation and debate, there's no better proof that that may be a viable way of doing things than actually going and doing it. And then, it's hard to argue with an artifact, right? Because it's an actual tangible outcome of the culture that you're talking about. Last one, down here.
I was going to ask who's going to win the rugby on the weekend, but I thought that might be a bit cheeky.
Probably the All Blacks.
So I just wanted to prioritise. You suggested lots of different ideas. What are the things that you would suggest? Like, if you were just going to start with one thing and you were going to do it now, what would be the first thing? Or what do you think? One-on-ones.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so that helps you build up a good feedback loop between the people that are meant to be running the show and the people that are on the ground that are actually doing the work and actually have a lot of control over it. Building that sort of team vision about like what the team's actually there to do, like why are you even there in the first place? Like why does it exist? Like that's a pretty good starting point to sort of drive the conversation about like what are the things that are important to us, what's the goal that we're moving towards, what are like the strategic filters that we've got that we can use to sort of make decisions about whether we should do this particular thing or not to achieve that particular goal. So start with one-on-ones and then actually, there's a whole other slide here. So probably the next, go and read pretty much all of these books, but the one to start with here is the middle one here, so by Patrick Lencioni, Silos, Politics and Turf Wars, and 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. So they're both very short, very easy to read. I highly recommend if you've got interest in the anthropological side of things that you go and have a read of Organizational Culture and Leadership. It will absolutely change your life.
And I just have one last question. You mentioned the process for recruiting and letting the team sort of go through the first sort of phases of selecting the candidate, evaluating them and such.
Yep.
And have the lead speak to them later. What would you advise in the situation where prior history has shown the actual process of recruitment results in a lot of filtering? Prior to selecting a candidate, that obviously has an overhead on the team at large. I completely agree with having the team vet the candidate.
Yep.
I'm just wondering if the lead should be involved more frequently.
Yeah, so I guess there's perhaps a step 0 to that, which is that there is some sort of vetting that happens prior to that. Like if it's very clear that like they're not able to meet sort of the base characteristics that you're looking for, or they don't have the talent at the level that you sort of expect, or at least a talent that's transferable to the level that you expect. So you use that sort of as the base step. But the other way to think about it is like rather than as an impact on the time of the people that are in the team to do all of this hiring, you're actually giving them practice in a very important, valuable professional skill, right, which is interviewing. So, not many people have that much of an opportunity to be able to do that sort of professional development. And if it's like, so I'm like I was saying, at the organisation that I'm at in the Australian government, we've done a massive amount of recruiting in the last 12 months. So when I started, I was the first technical employee. I must have done at least 200 interviews in the last year, and out of that we've hired about 40 people. And the only way that you can possibly make that scale, particularly when you're going that quickly, is by distributing the load. So, and by distributing the load, you're actually cultivating a particular skill, deepening a skill in those people.
So to go into sort of specific of that, the idea of having the lead with, say, a member of the team or something, is that a reasonable sort of a reasonable compromise?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, followed eventually by an entire team-based session.
Yeah, I mean, your mileage may vary. Like, you've got to adapt it based on the circumstance that you find yourself in. Like, the natural tendency of somebody that's in a leadership position is to dominate the conversation, right? And so even if you've got somebody that's like a team member and the team lead, and the team lead itself, if you actually analyze the conversation, the team lead is probably going to be doing the majority of the talking, right? So when you're in that leadership or management position, you've got to be really aware, and like, it's like, okay, I'm here and I'm present and I'm sort of part of the analysis, but you're actually driving this. Like, it's your responsibility to do it. I'm just a passenger.
Sweet. I want to experiment with.
Cool.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank
very
you.
much.